The frost came 3 weeks early that year, and it never really let go after that. By 4 in the morning, it had silvered every blade of grass on the North 40, and it held there long past sunrise. The kind of cold that doesn't just sit on top of the ground, but works its way down into the clay and stays a while. Cora Vance had learned to read that cold by then. She knew the exact taste of the air and the hour before the ground stiffened. She knew, without having to think about it, the precise moment it was safe to step outside without her breath catching wrong in her chest. She was 29 years old that October, standing at a fence line in Dakota Territory with 2 cups of coffee in her hands. And if you had told her 4 years earlier that this was where she'd end up, she would not have believed a word of it. She held 1 cup. The other she set down on the fence post to her right, where the wood was still pale and raw and smelled faintly of sawdust. The notch at the top cut clean and square by someone who knew what he was doing. The north fence ran straight for the first time in 4 years, every post plumb. The wire pulled taut post to post, holding against that huge Dakota sky the way she'd asked for back in the spring, when the ground was finally soft enough to dig. Behind her, the kitchen garden had already been put to bed for winter. The wheat was in the barn. The well had a cover on it now that didn't rock or shift no matter how hard you leaned on it, and the rope that ran down into the dark of that well was good rope that would hold for years. She wrapped both hands around her cup and let the heat bleed into her fingers. The country up here was the same as it had always been, that same flat reach of grass rolling toward low hills. That particular shade of early light that turns everything gold for about 10 minutes before the sun climbs too high and burns the sentiment right out of it. She'd never quite gotten used to how much that light still caught her, even now. She didn't look back at the house behind her. She didn't need to. She knew that little house the way she knew the weight of her own coffee pot, by feel, by 4 years of daily use, by the particular quiet it held in the hour before the rest of the world woke up. This is where the story ends, more or less, 2 cups on a fence line in October, a homestead standing whole behind her. A town 3 miles west that had spent a long time watching her and had, somewhere along the way, stopped. But it didn't begin here. It began on a train platform in a town she'd never set foot in April 4 years earlier, wearing city clothes that were already wrong for the mud before she'd finished stepping down off the car. It began with a steamer trunk and a deed to land she'd never laid eyes on, and the particular feeling of standing in plain view while strangers took one look at her and decided. Right there on the spot, exactly what she was worth. It began with a cough that wouldn't quit, and a well cover that had already caved in before she ever arrived. And 160 acres of grass and clay hardpan that expected absolutely nothing from her, and gave nothing back either, not at first. Land like that waits. It doesn't care what you hoped for, it just waits to see what you're actually made of. She hadn't known back then what she was made of. She had a fairly good idea now. The coffee steamed in the cold October air. The second cup sat waiting on the post. She kept her eyes on the open country and let the morning come the rest of the way in. The train pulled into Amity Ridge at 10:30 in the morning, which, as Cora would come to understand, was just about the worst possible hour for it. 10:30 meant the general store was open. It meant the livery had business, and the men with nothing pressing to do were finding reasons to loiter near the platform. It meant the light was high and flat, and there was nowhere in the whole town to be small in it. She stepped down onto the boards, and the mud found her immediately, a dark hem of it climbing the side of her boot before she'd even gotten both feet under her. The wind came off the open country and pressed her gray traveling dress flat against her legs and didn't let up. She set her trunk down and straightened her spine and took her first real look at the town she now, technically, belonged to. One street. Storefronts weathered the color of old rope. A livery with its doors thrown open to the cold. A church at the far end with a bell that had gone green with age. A lumber yard out at the western edge, boards stacked in long pale rows under the enormous, indifferent sky. She could feel, without needing to check, that she was being looked at. 3 men lingered near the far end of the platform, not quite pretending not to stare. A woman stood in the doorway of the general store with one hand flat against the frame, her expression somewhere between wary and not unkind. A boy of about 12 sat on a crate whittling something, and when Cora stepped off that train, his knife had simply stopped moving. She picked the trunk back up and walked toward the only building with a person visibly inside it. The general store smelled like flour and lamp oil, and underneath those two things, like a room that a lot of people relied on. The woman in the doorway hadn't exactly moved aside to let her pass, but she had stepped back just enough. Cora asked, plainly, about the road east toward Sable Creek. She asked how far 3 miles actually ran out here, where distance seemed to mean something different than it had in Boston. The woman answered her without warmth, but without cruelty either, just information, the way you'd give it to anyone passing through. Cora thanked her and turned to go. Behind her, she heard the small shuffle of the woman moving to the front window, and she knew, without turning around to check, that she was being watched all the way across the street. Her narrow gray shape measured against that enormous sky, the whole town already doing its silent arithmetic on how long a woman like that would actually last. There was no wagon to be had, not for a stranger with no credit and a deed nobody in town had bothered to verify yet. The man at the livery looked at her thin-soled boots and her city buttons and offered her a horse in the exact tone of a man who expects to be turned down. She surprised him. She simply didn't have the first idea how to ride, and she wasn't about to admit that out loud, so she thanked him and walked out instead. 3 miles east, then. There was no other way to do it. The road wasn't really a road, more a line of intention pressed into the grass by however many wagon wheels had passed that way over however many seasons. It ran dead straight for a while, and then it simply didn't. The sky above it was every bit as big as people back east had warned her it would be, and she still didn't quite believe it, even walking directly underneath it. Boston had sky too, technically, but it was a narrow thing, cut into strips by rooftops and chimneys, and the general understanding that life continued busily on either side of whatever you happened to be doing at the moment. Out here, the sky simply didn't stop. It was all of it all at once, and after one long look, she decided not to look at it again for a while. She kept her eyes on the road ahead and she walked. The trunk stayed at the station to be sent for later. She carried only what fit over her shoulder, a satchel with the deed folded inside it, and a battered tin coffee pot she carried by its dark, dented handle because she didn't trust it to survive a second trip unattended. The homestead announced itself with a smell before it announced itself with a shape, turned clay and old grass. And underneath that something faintly mineral that she'd later understand was Sable Creek, cutting across the southeast corner of her land beyond a low rise. Then the shape itself came into view, a low sod house, the color of the dirt it was built from barely distinguishable from the flat country around it. 2 rooms. The well cover had slumped in on one side, tilting inward over the black mouth of the hole. The fence along the north boundary ran crooked for a stretch and then simply gave up. Grass grew tall and undisturbed against the east wall, where nobody had walked or cut anything back in a long while. She stood at the edge of what was, on paper, hers, and looked at it for a long moment. Then she walked up to the door and stood in the frame. Inside, it was dim and low, and it smelled like cold dirt and something older than that. A small iron stove sat against one wall, its flue gone to rust at the joint. A table. One window, the glass intact, which struck her, standing there as faintly improbable given the state of everything else. The floor was packed earth. The only sound was the wind pressing steadily against the outside walls, as if the whole country were leaning on the little house just to test whether it would hold. She crossed the room and set her coffee pot down on the cold stove. Cold stove, cold pot, 3 miles from a town that had already made up its mind about her. She looked out the one window at her crooked north fence in the fading afternoon light, and she did not look away. She stayed that first night and the night after that. On the first morning, she found clay at the creek bank and packed it into the flue joint with her thumb, smoothing it flat, and it held not forever but enough. She built a small fire out of dry grass pulled from the east wall and a few sticks left stacked inside the door by someone she would never meet. The coffee pot heated slowly. She stood close while it did, hands out toward the iron, and outside the wind kept coming across the open ground exactly as it had the night before, with no particular interest in her one way or the other. She'd been out there 6 days when she heard the horse, a big animal walking in from the north, unhurried. She was on her knees beside the collapsed well cover at the time, threading rope through a loop she'd rigged to brace the sagging side, and she didn't stand up. She looked at the rider once, long enough to take his measure, and then went back to her rope. He was broad through the chest, a man well into his 50s, in a coat that had clearly weathered a great many seasons and come through fine. He sat his horse the way men do when they're used to being looked up at. He gave his name, Cyrus Bellamy, and said his land ran along her north boundary. Said he'd been out this way and thought he'd stop and have a word. She kept threading the rope. He said he'd made some inquiries about her acreage. Said he was prepared to make a fair offer, cash in hand, for the full 160. He named a figure and let it hang there in the cold air between them, like something she was supposed to pick up and turn over in her hands. She didn't look up. She had the rope through the loop by then and was testing the tension against the near post. "No, thank you," she said. That was the whole of it. He waited, maybe expecting a counteroffer, or at least a question. She reached for the second length of rope and started threading it through the far loop instead. She heard him turn his horse and ride back north. She didn't watch him go. She finished bracing the cover, pressed down on the edge with both palms to test it, found that it held, wiped her hands on her skirt, and went back inside. She noticed in the days that followed that when she straightened up from her work and looked north, there was sometimes a rider sitting motionless along the far ridge, just there, watching. She'd been out past the creek since mid-morning, working the low corner of the east field where the clay ran close to the surface, trying to understand whether it would hold seed or whether she'd need to plan around it entirely. She walked the line of it twice, boots sinking with every step, pressing down to feel where the ground went soft and where it held firm. She had no paper with her. She committed what she found to memory the way she'd learned to commit most things by then, by standing still long enough that it simply became part of her. She walked back in the late afternoon with the light dropping flat and gold across the grass, and she saw it from 30 yards out. The well cover sat solid and square in its frame. 2 rope braces ran clean from the near post to the far side, pulled tight and knotted in a way she knew, immediately, she hadn't managed herself. Not for lack of strength, the anchor points on the east side had been rotted clean through, and somebody had replaced them. New wood, cut and fitted flush. The cover sat level for the first time since she'd arrived on this land. She stood at the edge of it and pressed down with one palm. It didn't shift an inch. She looked around the yard. Nothing else disturbed. No clear boot prints in the dry ground. No note tucked under a stone. She went inside, put the coffee pot on to boil, and stood at the window while it did, watching the empty yard as if it might explain itself. It didn't. The next morning she walked into town. The general store was quiet at that hour. The owner, a woman named Ruth Colby, careful-eyed, a woman who spoke only exactly as much as a situation required, stood behind the counter working through a ledger. Her daughter sat on the floor near the door, 7 years old, occupied with a length of twine and a wooden spool, deep in some private project only she understood. Cora asked at the counter whether anyone had come out the east road recently. A man with carpentry tools, maybe, or lumber in a cart. Ruth looked up from her ledger, seemed about to answer, and the girl on the floor beat her to it. She didn't even look up from her spool. She said the name the way children say things they've simply always known to be true, with no more ceremony than announcing that the creek runs south or that winter comes in November. "Jonah Prout," the girl said. "He's got the lumber yard west end." Ruth glanced down at her daughter, then back at her ledger, and didn't correct a word of it. Cora thanked them both. The girl had already gone back to her twine. The lumber yard sat at the far end of the main street, past the point where the buildings gave out and the open country reasserted itself. Raw boards were stacked along the south wall, weathered gray at the ends. Sawdust had settled into the ground near the entrance in a pale ring, lighter than the dirt around it, the way snow settles in the lee of a wall. She found him inside at a workbench, fitting a length of trim. He didn't look up right away, but something in the set of his shoulders changed, a small stillness that told her he'd already heard her come in. She said she'd come to settle what she owed him. He set the trim down and turned around. His hands were chalked pale with sawdust. He was younger than Cyrus Bellamy by a fair margin, maybe midway through his 30s. With the kind of build a man gets from years of lifting lumber rather than years of sitting a horse and giving orders. He named a figure. She'd already calculated in her head roughly what the materials alone would have cost, the wood for the well frame, the hardware. The better part of a day spent riding out and back, and the number he gave her was well under that. Low enough that she noticed, low enough that he clearly saw her notice. Neither of them said a word about it. She counted the bills onto the workbench. He folded them once and set them aside without recounting. There was a silence that, oddly, didn't feel uncomfortable. Her eyes drifted over the boards stacked along the interior wall, rough cut, still carrying the smell of fresh sap underneath the older smell of dust and honest work. She let her gaze travel the lengths without any particular purpose, the way a person looks around a room they aren't quite ready to leave yet. She asked what he charged for split rail. He told her. She said her north fence needed real attention come spring, 3 separate stretches gone soft near the posts, though she wasn't sure yet exactly how many she'd need to replace. He nodded once and said he could set some aside for her. She said she'd appreciate that. Then, before she'd quite decided to, she heard herself say she'd take a small order right now. 4 lengths, whatever he had on hand for general use. He didn't ask what it was for. He crossed to the stack along the wall and started pulling lengths, and she watched him work, no wasted motion. The kind of economy a man's body only learns after doing the same task enough times that it stops requiring thought and just runs on instinct. He stacked the 4 lengths by the door. She picked up 2 of them before he could reach for all 4 himself, which he seemed to register without comment. They carried the lumber out to the road together. She thanked him. He said she was welcome. She walked the 3 miles home with the wood under her arm, and the town carried on around her the way it always did, indifferent and watching in equal measure. Winter came in that October 3 full weeks early, and it didn't apologize for it. She woke one morning to frost forming on the inside of the sod walls and understood, immediately and completely, that she had not prepared enough. She'd cut and stacked what wood she could through September, and she'd known even while stacking it that it wasn't going to be enough. There had been the fence, the garden to put down properly, the well cover, and the days had a way of filling up past any reasonable accounting. So she looked at the pile honestly, admitted the truth of it, and decided her only real option left was to be careful. By December, the town had done its own math about her, too. She could see it in the way people shifted around her in the general store. A slight softening, almost sympathetic, the way a person looks at something they've already privately started to grieve. The man at the livery said nothing to her. Ruth Colby said nothing either, but a covered dish appeared on Cora's porch step one mid-December afternoon. A cloth laid over it, no knock at the door, no note. Cora stood in her own doorway holding it, looking out at the empty road, and then she brought it inside. The cough had been with her since Boston. It had lived at the back of her throat like something patient, waiting its turn. Through the summer it had stayed manageable, a dryness, an occasional catch, nothing that slowed her hands down. In December it changed. It sank down into her chest and started coming on at night, so that she'd wake in the cold dark working hard to breathe quietly, as if silence alone could keep it from being something serious. She moved her sleeping pallet closer to the stove. She rationed her wood by eye each evening, this many pieces to carry her through to midnight, this many to last until dawn. She kept the fire low enough to be responsible and high enough to be survivable, and she learned exactly where that line ran. It was a thin line. She walked it every single night through January. The coffee pot sat on the hearth each morning before first light. When the stove had burned down too low to be useful, she boiled the water directly against the coals, wrapping both hands around the worn dark handle afterward and letting the heat climb slowly up through her palms and into her wrists. Some mornings that was the only warmth she generated before the sun finally showed itself. She drank it standing at the window, watching frost gray at the edges as the light shifted. The covered dish appeared a second time in January. Same cloth. No knock. She had no idea how many people in Amity Ridge actually expected her to make it through the winter. She suspected the number was small. She thought about that sometimes in the coldest hours of the night, and then she thought about the wood pile instead and whether it needed adjusting. It always needed adjusting. February came in harder than January had left. The cold found new angles to work through, under the door, through the gap where the sod had settled along the north wall, up through the floorboards in the dark hour before dawn. She caulked the worst gap with strips torn from a petticoat she no longer had any use for in town anyway. She rolled a length of burlap tight against the base of the door. She noted every draft the way a carpenter notes a joint that won't quite close. And she addressed them one at a time until the little sod house held its heat the way a cupped hand holds water, imperfectly, but enough. The cough didn't leave entirely, but it changed character, looser in the mornings, quieter by midday, which she came to understand was improvement even on days it didn't feel like one. She drank her coffee hot, kept her chest toward the stove, and avoided lying down in the coldest corners of the house whenever she had a choice about it. March arrived without any real announcement. The light simply started staying a little longer each afternoon. The frost on the window took a bit more time to form each night. One morning she noticed the ground at the southeast corner near the creek had softened enough to hold a clear boot print, and something in her chest eased that had nothing to do with the cough. She walked into town on a Tuesday. The mud on the main street was the grabbing kind that demands your full attention with every step. She traded her city button boots for a plain, wide-soled pair from the general store back in October, built for exactly this. She pushed open the door. The room didn't fall silent exactly. It just adjusted. A man near the back counter glanced up, held his look on her a half-second longer than a passing glance requires, and went back to his business. Ruth Colby set down the tin she'd been shelving and turned, not a greeting, something more considered than that. Before anyone spoke, something small came barreling out from behind the counter. Ruth's daughter, now closer to 8, came at her with one hand out, and her whole face open in that particular way children get when they've been holding on to something all morning, and finally found the right person to give it to. She pressed a small, flat stone into Cora's palm. Gray, oval, a single white line running straight through the center like someone had drawn it on with chalk. "Found it by the platform," the girl said. "The line goes all the way through." Cora turned it once in her fingers. "It does," she said. Ruth had gone very still behind the counter. The man near the back hadn't gone back to his conversation either. Something in the room had quietly rearranged itself, the way furniture sometimes gets moved in the night without anyone announcing it, and nobody remarked on it out loud, least of all Cora. She kept that stone on the windowsill above her dry sink after that, where the morning light found it first, every day, without fail. Spring came late to Amity Ridge that year, the frost holding through the first weeks of April before finally letting go. Cora had spent the whole winter studying her 160 acres the way her father used to study his account ledgers back east, methodically, section by section, noting what held water and what shed it, where the clay hardpan gave way to something softer, where the grass grew thickest along the low ground near Sable Creek. By the time the earth was finally workable, she already knew exactly where the kitchen garden would go. She broke the ground herself with a borrowed mattock, working 2-hour stretches until her arms simply gave out and made her stop. The cough had eased some with the warmer air, though it never left completely. She planted her rows close and straight, onion sets, turnip seed, a short bed of carrots along the south-facing edge where the sod wall would hold the day's heat into the evening. The wheat went in at the far end of the bottom acre, 30 yards of it, modest enough that she wouldn't need to ask anyone for help bringing it in come fall. Here's where things start to shift, though, because a homestead that survived one brutal winter alone doesn't stay quite so alone. Jonah came by in June. She didn't hear him arrive. She was down at the creek filling her second water bucket, and when she came back up the rise, he was already crouched at her doorframe, running his thumb along the lower sill, where the wood had gone soft and gray. He'd brought lumber with him. He had the frame replaced inside an hour, the new pale wood standing out sharply against the dark old sod wall, and then he left without staying for a meal or offering any explanation at all. She found the pulled nails stacked in a neat little pile beside the door, evened up the way you'd clear a table before walking away from it. He came again in August, and this time he walked her entire north fence line without being asked, stopping at every leaning post, testing the base of 2 of them with his boot. She watched him from the garden and didn't bother pretending she wasn't watching. He came back over to where she stood and told her plainly that he'd return in the fall to set it right. She didn't say anything. He left. Fall arrived. The wheat came in thin but whole. The kitchen garden did better than she'd had any real right to expect, given the winter behind it. She waited without quite admitting to herself that she was waiting through September, through October, through the first hard cold week of November. When the ground began to stiffen again, and the window for setting new posts finally closed for the season. He didn't come. She mended what she could on her own, restrung 3 sections of loose wire, packed clay around 2 posts the frost had already started to heave. She did not go to the lumber yard. She did not send word. She had learned, somewhere in that first brutal winter, that need and asking were not the same thing, and she wasn't in any hurry to confuse them. The second winter broke slowly, the frost pulling back from the clay in stages instead of all at once. She planted earlier than she strictly had any right to, and for once lost nothing to a late freeze. The cough, which had tracked her for 2 full winters like a second shadow, finally began to loosen sometime in March. She noticed it the way she noticed most things by then. Not in the moment it happened, but afterward, realizing it had been a while since it had woken her in the dark. The cold air didn't catch in her chest quite the same way anymore. She didn't dwell on what that might mean. She planted her second row of carrots and moved on to the next task. The wheat that year came in small but whole, 40 bushels on a field that had given her only 31 the year before. She stood at the edge of the cut rows on the last evening of harvest and looked at what was actually there, without measuring it against whatever she'd imagined 4 years earlier when she first stepped off that train. She'd learned by then not to look at things that way anymore. The garden surprised her too. She traded squash at the general store that September, 5 of them, carried over in a cloth sack, and Ruth Colby weighed them without a word of comment on the quality, which turned out to be the only comment that actually mattered. She traded again in October, dried beans this time, and walked home with half a pound of coffee and 2 yards of flannel tucked under her arm. She saw Jonah at the platform when the supply rail came through in late September. He was there for a lumber shipment, she assumed. She was there for a bolt of cloth she'd ordered back in August. The platform was busy enough that the 2 of them standing near each other went unremarked. He said something about pine prices, that they'd gone up again and the mill over in Millbrook wasn't apologizing for it. She said she'd heard as much. He mentioned she'd ordered cedar for her gate posts. She said she had. He crossed his arms and looked out at the incoming freight cars and didn't say anything else for a long moment, and she didn't fill the silence for him. Then he turned and looked at her. Not the way a person looks at someone they're mid-conversation with. Not even the way a person looks at someone they simply know. It was quieter than either of those things, a kind of attention with no transaction folded into it, no question waiting to be asked or answered. She recognized it the way you recognize something you've seen before somewhere but never had the right word for. She looked back at the freight car instead. Her bolt of cloth arrived. She signed for it and lifted it herself before he had the chance to move. She carried it to her wagon without looking back toward the platform. She thought about it the entire 3 miles home. The first frost of the 3rd autumn came early again, and this time she woke to it on a Tuesday morning, the window glass furred pale at the corners. The air inside the sod house, carrying a bite the fall rains hadn't warned her about. She lay still for a moment the way she'd trained herself to, cataloging the sounds outside, wind off the open country, the creek running low, and then something else underneath those 2. She went to the window. He was already out there. The light was barely light yet, just the suggestion of it, the sky pale gray over the eastern grass, sun still below the horizon. Jonah stood at the north boundary with a post-hole digger, and a straight line of cedar posts laid out along the fence line she'd marked with stakes back in the spring. He'd already been at it long enough that the first post was set and tamped down solid. She hadn't heard a wagon pull up. She hadn't heard anything at all. She stood at that window in her coat thrown over her nightgown and watched him work for a long moment. He moved without hurry and without a single wasted motion, the same way he seemed to move at everything. The digger went in. He worked it, lifted the loose earth clear, set the next post, packed the ground back down with his boot heel and then the flat end of a spare board, moved on to the next stake. The frost still sat on the grass around him, and his breath showed pale in the cold with every exhale. She didn't go straight out. She built her fire first, put the coffee pot on and let it come to a boil while she dressed and pinned up her hair and pulled on her boots, not the button ones from Boston anymore. Those had given out 2 winters back, but the plain, heavy pair that had already seen 3 full seasons of hard use. When the coffee was ready, she poured 2 cups and carried them out across the frosted grass. He was 3 posts from the end by then. She walked to the closest finished post, the one nearest where he was working, and set 1 cup down on its flat top without a word. Then she stood beside it with her own cup, facing the same direction he was. He looked up when he heard her boots in the grass. He looked at the cup waiting on the post. He set the digger down, picked the cup up with both hands, and turned to face the open country the same way she was already facing it. They just stood there. The sun was finally clearing the eastern grass, low and amber, burning the frost off in thin, curling wisps wherever the light reached it. The homestead sat quiet behind them. 4 years of it, all of it still and settled in the early morning. Neither one of them said a single word. The sun had cleared the grass completely by the time he set the last post. She heard it before she saw it, 3 deliberate strikes, a 4th, then quiet. She didn't turn around. She heard him test it, boot against the base, that small creak and settle of packed earth holding firm, and then the sound of him shouldering the digger and leaning it against the finished fence line. He picked his cup back up off the post and finished it in one long swallow. She finished hers too. She reached out and took his empty cup from his hand without asking, and he let her have it without a word of protest. She held both cups loosely in one hand and looked out at the open country a moment longer, the grass rolling east in long, pale waves, the sky above it enormous and still. The light turning that particular color of something almost finished, becoming something else entirely. Then she turned, he turned with her. They walked back across the north field together without talking, frost-silvered grass crunching soft underfoot. The homestead came into view piece by piece the way it always did from that direction. The mended fence along the west side first, then the kitchen garden gone brown and cut back for winter. Then the well-covered Jonah had built her that very first May, from lumber he'd never once let her pay him for. Then the low shape of the sod house itself, door standing open to the October morning, the way she always left it whenever the light was good. The wheat stubble caught the sun off to their left, 3 acres of it. The first 2 years had failed her, the third hadn't. She stepped up onto the little porch and he followed her in behind her. She set both cups down on the counter near the wash basin. The dented coffee pot sat waiting on the stove exactly where she'd left it, dark-handled, still faintly warm to the touch. The same pot she'd carried 3 miles down a dirt road in a steamer trunk on her very first day in this country. The same pot that had sat on this stove through 4 springs, 4 summers, 4 autumns, and 1 hard winter still left to come. She didn't move it. He stood just inside the doorway for a moment, hat in hand, the way he sometimes did when he was quietly deciding whether to stay or go. She didn't look at him to nudge him one way or the other. She just let the moment be exactly what it was. He hung his hat on the peg beside the door. The door stayed open behind him. The October light came pouring through it, flat and amber, laying itself in a long rectangle across the packed earth floor, reaching all the way to the edge of the stove. Outside, the fence ran the full length of the north boundary now, unbroken, plumb holding. And beyond it, the country went on the way it always had, wide, unhurried, exactly as it had always been, and somehow, standing there in her own doorway, entirely different too. So that's Cora Vance's 4 years, more or less. A woman who got handed a deed to land nobody thought she'd survive, and a coffee pot that outlasted 2 winters and a whole town's quiet bets against her. What would you have done, stepping off that train alone with nothing but a trunk and an address you'd never seen? Would you have taken Cyrus Bellamy's money and gone home? Or would you have stayed and fought that ground for 4 winters the way Cora did? Let me know down in the comments where you're watching this from tonight. I always love seeing how far this story travels. And if you liked spending this time out on the Dakota Plains with Cora, do me a favor and hit subscribe, drop a like, and share it with somebody who'd enjoy it too. I've got more stories like this one coming, and I'd love to have you back for the next one.